What kind of man defeats a massive global empire only to just voluntarily walk away from ultimate power when the dust finally settles? It's honestly one of the most fascinating questions in modern history. Think about it. We're looking at a man who literally had the chance to be a king. He had an army at his back, a nation completely adoring him, but he made the stunning choice to build a republic instead.
So, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the extraordinary, challenging, and, often contradictory life of United States' most important founding father. We're going to explore the crucible that forged George Washington. Because look, this isn't just a story about the guy on the dollar bill. It's literally the blueprint of how a modern democratic nation was built totally from scratch.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, his youth and first battles. Then, the War of Independence. Third, the rejection of the crown. Fourth, his time as the first president. And finally, number 5, contradictions and final legacy. Let's get right into it.
All right, Section 1, Youth and First Battles.
So our journey starts way back in 1732, in a world where the United States didn't even exist yet. The East Coast was just 13 separate British colonies. George was born into a pretty well-off Virginian farming family, but unfortunately, tragedy struck early. At just 11 years old, Washington lost his father, and this was a huge turning point for him. It meant he had to bypass the formal university education that a lot of the other founding fathers got. Instead, he had to quickly learn survival and discipline. He actually took up work as a land surveyor, measuring out the vast, untamed wilderness. And it was out there, in that rugged terrain, that he really learned observation, planning, and just raw self-reliance.
And those wilderness skills, they were immediately put to the test. In the 1750s, he fought in the French and Indian War, and this brutal conflict became his necessary classroom. He learned it all here: strategy, logistics, leadership, troop organization, and probably most importantly, decision-making under extreme pressure. Did he make mistakes? Oh, absolutely. But the experience he gained here would eventually become the absolute lifeline of the American Revolution.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, the War of Independence.
By the 1770s, the landscape was shifting dramatically. After years of global conflict, the British Empire was basically drowning in debt, and to pay for it, they slapped heavy taxes on the American colonies. This powerful central grievance became the massive rallying cry: no taxation without representation. The colonists were furious, and rightly so. They were paying into a system where they had absolutely zero political voice back in London. The tension just couldn't hold. So by 1775, open rebellion broke out, and the Continental Congress officially appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief.
Now, Washington faced just impossible odds when he took command. To put this into perspective, on one side you have the British Empire. They're the greatest superpower on Earth, armed with better training, endless funds, superior weapons, and the world's most powerful navy. On the other side, Washington's Continental Army. Basically a ragtag militia with incredibly scarce resources, starting completely from zero. He wasn't just fighting a war, he was trying to build an army while fighting a war. Wild, right?
To even survive, Washington realized he had to take massive, unprecedented risks. One of the most legendary moments of his life, and really of American history, happened on the night of December 25, 1776. Facing crushing defeats and a total collapse of morale, he led his men across the freezing, ice-choked Delaware River during a fierce winter storm. This dangerous surprise attack on Trenton was a desperate gamble, but man, it worked. It secured a massive, much-needed morale-boosting victory just when the revolution was basically on death's door.
But get this, his biggest challenge wasn't actually on the battlefield. The true test of his leadership came during the horrific winter at Valley Forge in 1777 to 1778. The conditions were an absolute nightmare. We're talking starvation, extreme cold, rampant diseases, and a near-total lack of basic supplies. Thousands suffered. The fact that the army didn't just pack up and desert is a true testament to Washington's sheer force of will. He stayed with his men, suffering right alongside them, and his leadership literally became the glue holding the entire revolution together.
And finally, the tide turned. In 1781, Washington executed a total masterclass in military strategy at the Siege of Yorktown. By perfectly coordinating with French allied forces, both on land and at sea, Washington managed to trap the British Army under Lord Cornwallis. The British had no choice but to surrender. Against all odds, this ragtag army had won. The 1783 Treaty of Paris followed, and American independence was officially recognized by the world.
Which brings us to Section 3, the rejection of the crown.
This right here is a moment that defined the entire future of the world. The crucial turning point in his life actually comes right after the war. Washington held absolute military power. His men adored him, the nation practically worshipped him. A lot of people fully expected, and honestly wanted, him to seize power and just declare himself a king. That was the historical norm. But Washington stunned the entire world. He walked right into Congress, resigned his military command, and simply went home to his farm at Mount Vernon. This one single act proved once and for all that this new nation would truly be a republic, not a dictatorship or a monarchy.
All right, moving to Section 4, the first president. Well, his retirement wouldn't last long. By 1787, the struggling young country was fracturing. The leaders convened the Constitutional Convention, and they knew they needed Washington. His mere presence generated this immense trust among some very deeply divided delegates. Under his steady guidance as president of the convention, they created the U.S. Constitution. This brilliant document divided power into 3 distinct branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, and created the entirely new office of the presidency.
And when it came time to choose that first president in 1789, the choice was pretty obvious. George Washington was elected with 100% of the electoral vote. Let that sink in for a second. 100%. That is a feat that has literally never been repeated in American history. Entering this office, Washington had no instruction manual. He practically had to invent the modern presidency from scratch, setting the traditions, the tone, and even the limits of executive power.
During his 2 terms, stabilizing the young country was absolutely paramount. One of his most critical moves was championing the financial system designed by his brilliant Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. This system rested on 4 main pillars: creating solid national credit, paying off massive war debts, financing economic growth, and generating international trust. Washington backing this model laid the core economic foundation that really allowed the United States to survive those early years and eventually thrive.
After 2 terms, Washington did it again. He voluntarily stepped down in 1797, cementing the tradition of a peaceful transfer of power. But he didn't leave without a final message. In his famous farewell address, he issued some pretty stark warnings to the nation. He warned against the dangers of extreme political partisanship, the creeping threat of political corruption, and the trap of dangerous foreign alliances. When you read those warnings today, they still feel incredibly relevant, don't they?
Okay, finally, Section 5, contradictions and final legacy.
As we transition to his final years back at Mount Vernon, we really have to confront the complex realities of his life alongside all his triumphs. And that brings us to a deeply profound question. How do we judge a champion of liberty who owned enslaved people? We have to neutrally examine this central contradiction of Washington's life. He dedicated his life to fighting for human liberty and independence from British tyranny, yet he lived within and directly benefited from a brutal system of human slavery. It really is the great paradox of the American founding.
The historical fact is that Washington was an enslaver throughout his entire life. However, historical records also show that his private doubts about the institution grew significantly over time. In his final act, his will uniquely ordered the emancipation of the enslaved people he legally owned upon the death of his wife. Now, while this obviously doesn't erase the reality of his life as an enslaver, it does highlight a deep internal wrestling with the moral contradictions of his era. It was actually a step no other slave-owning founding father took in their will.
Let's quickly review this incredible timeline we've covered today. From his birth in Virginia in 1732, stepping up as commander of the Continental Army in 1775, securing independence in 1783, taking the oath as the first president in 1789, retiring to set a democratic standard in 1797, and finally passing away in 1799 at the age of 67. It's a dense, incredibly high-stakes life that fundamentally shaped the modern democratic world as we know it.
Ultimately, George Washington stands as the main military and political architect of the United States. Despite his profound human contradictions, his ability to win a seemingly impossible war against a global superpower, his indispensable role in building a new constitutional government, and his unmatched commitment to the peaceful transfer of power, completely solidified him as the nation's most important founding father.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to consider. Without a leader uniquely willing to voluntarily surrender supreme power, and not just once, but twice, would this whole democratic experiment have even survived its birth? It's a pretty powerful reminder that the systems we rely on today were built on the extraordinarily rare choices of the people who came before us, something to definitely keep in mind as you continue exploring history.